Welcome to the Asian Post.
In 1917, on the 2nd of November, Britain's Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur James Balfour, following the defeat and retreat of the Ottoman Turks from Arab lands during the First World War, released a paper calling for creation of a state for Jews of Europe in the land of Palestine. This scandalous paper, which came to be known as the Balfour Declaration, emboldened the British to settle hundreds of thousands of mostly East European Jews in the Muslim land of Palestine, and finally planting of the illegal Zionist regime in May of 1948. Till this day, the Palestinian people and the rest of the Muslim world are suffering from the crimes against humanity of this cancerous tumor called Israel. We present you a thought-stimulating article written by Alison Weir. The article is titled, "Who Wrote the Balfour Declaration and Why? The First World War Connection." Stay with us for more of Alison Weir's article. Historical evidence shows that Zionists pushed for the United States to enter the First World War on Britain's side as part of a deal to gain British support for their colonization of Palestine. Most analysts consider First World War a pointless conflict that resulted from diplomatic entanglements rather than some travesty of justice or aggression. Yet it was catastrophic to a generation of Europeans, killing 14 million people. The United States of America joined this unnecessary war a few years into the hostilities, costing many American lives, even though the United States was not party to the alliances that had drawn other nations into the fray. This even though Americans had been strongly opposed to entering the war, and US President at the time Woodrow Wilson had won the presidency with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." President Woodrow Wilson changed course in 1917 and plunged the United States into that tragic European conflict. Approximately 320,000 Americans were killed or injured in the First World War. Over 1,200 American citizens who opposed the war were rounded up and imprisoned, some of them for years. A number of reasons were publicly given for Woodrow Wilson's change of heart, including Germany's submarine warfare, Germany's sinking of the British passenger ship Lusitania, and a diplomatic debacle known as the Zimmerman telegram episode. Historians also add pro-British propaganda and economic reasons to the list of causes, and most suggest that a number of factors were at play. Whilst the American public today are aware of many of these facts, few know that Zionism appears to have been one of those factors. Zionism was a political movement to create a Jewish state in Palestine. When this movement began in the late 1800s, the population of Palestine was 96% Muslim and Christian. The majority of Jews around the world were not Zionists. There are numerous historical documents and evidence which show that Zionists pushed for the United States to enter the First World War on Britain's side, as part of a deal to gain British support for their colonization of Palestine. From the very beginning of their movement, Zionists realized that if they were to succeed in their goal of creating a Jewish state on the land that was already inhabited by Palestinian Muslims, they needed backing from one of the great powers. They tried the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Palestine at the time, but were turned down, although they were told that Jews could settle throughout other parts of the Ottoman Empire and become Turkish citizens. They then turned to Britain, which was also initially less than enthusiastic. Famous English West Asian experts such as Gertrude Bell pointed out that Palestine was Arab and that Jerusalem, that is, the city of Beit al-Maqdis, was sacred to all three major monotheistic religions. Lord George Curzon, the British Viceroy in India, who later became Britain's Foreign Secretary, similarly stated that Palestine was already inhabited by 500,000 Palestinian Arabs, who would not be content either to be expropriated for Jewish immigrants or to act merely as hewers of wood and drawers of water for the latter. However, once the British were embroiled in the First World War, and particularly during 1916, a disastrous year for the Allies in which there were 60,000 British casualties in one day alone in the Battle of Somme, the Zionists were able to play a winning card. Whilst they previously had appealed to religious or idealistic arguments, now Zionist leaders could add a particularly powerful motivator, telling the British government that Zionists in the United States would push America to enter the First World War on side of Britain, if the British promised to support a Jewish home in Palestine afterwards. In 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary at the time, Lord Balfour, issued a letter to Zionist leader Lord Rothschild. Known as the Balfour Declaration, this letter promised that Britain would view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this objective. The letter then qualified this somewhat by stating that it should be clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The non-Jewish communities, or Muslims, along with Christians, were 92% of Palestine's population at the time, vigorous Zionist immigration efforts having slightly expanded the percentage of Jews living in Palestine by that date. The letter, whilst officially signed by Arthur James Balfour, had been in process for 2 years and had gone through a number of edits by British and American Zionists and British officials. A Zionist leader, Nahum Sokolov, later wrote, "Every idea born in London was tested by the Zionist Organization America, and every suggestion in America received the most careful attention in London." Sokolov wrote that British Zionists were helped, above all, by American Zionists. Between London, New York and Washington, there was constant communication, either by telegraph or by personal visits, and as a result, there was perfect unity amongst the Zionists of both hemispheres. The final version of the Balfour Declaration was actually written by Leopold Amery, a British official who, it came out later, was a secret and fervent Zionist himself. It appears that the idea for such a declaration had been originally promoted by Horace Callan, founder of Parushim, a secret Zionist society who taught at Princeton University. Author Peter Gross writes that in November of 1915, long before the United States was involved in the war, Horace Callan suggested the idea of a well-connected British friend. According to Callan, such a statement would give a natural outlet for the spontaneous pro-English, French and Italian sympathies of the Jewish masses. Horace Callan told his friend that this would help break down America's neutrality, which Callan knew was the aim of British diplomacy, desperate to bring the United States into the First World War on Britain's side. Whilst the Balfour Declaration was less than a ringing endorsement of Zionism, the Zionists considered it a major breakthrough because it cracked open a door that they would later force open wider and wider. In fact, Many credit this as a key instrument of the creation of Israel. The Balfour World War I negotiations are referred to in various documents. Samuel Landman, the secretary of the World Zionist Organization, described them in detail in a 1936 article in World Jewry. Landman explained that a secret agreement had been made in 1916 between the British government and Zionist leaders. After an understanding had been arrived at between Sir Mark Sykes and Zionist leaders, particularly Weizmann and Sokolov, it was resolved to send a secret message to Justice Brandeis that the British cabinet would help the Jews to gain Palestine in return for active Jewish sympathy and for support in the United States for the Allied cause, so as to bring about a radical pro-Allied tendency in the United States. Samuel Landman wrote that once the British had agreed to help the Zionists, this information was communicated to the press, which he reportedly rapidly began to favor the United States joining the First World War on the side of Britain. Landman claimed that Zionists had fulfilled their side of the contract and it was Jewish help that brought the United States into the First World War on the side of the Allies. British Colonial Secretary Lord Cavendish also wrote about this agreement and its result in a 1923 memorandum to the British Cabinet at the time. The memorandum states, "The object of the Balfour Declaration was to enlist the sympathies on the Allied side of influential Jews and Jewish organizations all over the world." And it is arguable that the negotiations with the Zionists did in fact have considerable effect in advancing the date at which the United States government intervened in the First World War. Former British Prime Minister Lord George similarly referred to the deal, telling a British commission in 1935, "Zionist leaders gave us a definite promise that if the Allies committed themselves to giving facilities for the establishment of a national home for Jews in Palestine, they would do their best to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause. They kept their word." Brandeis University professor and author Frank Manuel reported that Lloyd George had testified in 1937 that stimulating the war effort of American Jews was one of the major motives which, during a harrowing period in European war, actuated members of the cabinet in finally casting their votes for the Balfour Declaration. American career Foreign Service officer and diplomat Evan Wilson, who had served as Minister and Consul General in the city of Beit al-Muqaddas, also described his arrangement in his book, Decision on Palestine. Evan Wilson wrote that the Balfour Declaration was given to the Jews largely for the purpose of enlisting Jewish support in the First World War and of forestalling a similar promise by the Axis of Powers. The official biographer of Lloyd George, author Malcolm Thompson, stated that the determining factor in the decision to issue the Balfour Declaration was the scheme for engaging, by some such concession, the support of American Zionists for the Allied cause in the First World War. Similarly, Zionist historian Naomi Cohen calls the Balfour Declaration a wartime measure and writes, "Its immediate objective was to capture Jewish sympathy, especially in the United States, for the Allies and to shore up England's strategic interests in the Near East. The Balfour Declaration was pushed," she writes, "by leading Zionists in England and by Brandeis, who intervened with President Woodrow Wilson. Finally, David Ben-Gurion, who was to become the first premier of the Zionist regime, wrote in 1939, "To a certain extent, America had played a decisive role in the First World War. An American Jewry had a considerable part, knowingly or not, in the achievement of the Balfour Declaration." Earlier, in 1935, speaking at the 19th Zionist Congress in Lucerne, Switzerland, David Ben-Gurion had said, American Jewry had a considerable part, knowingly or not, in the achievement of the Balfour Declaration. Most Jews in the United States and elsewhere, including in Palestine itself, were not Zionists, and some strenuously opposed Zionism. The influence of Brandeis and other Zionists in the United States had enabled Zionists to form an alliance with Britain, a suspicious development in favor of a non-state group and a measure of Zionist growing power. American Zionists may also have played a role in preventing an early peace with the Ottoman Empire. In May of 1917, American Secretary of State at the time, Robert Lansing, received a report that the Ottomans were extremely weary of the war and that it might be possible to induce them to break with Germany and make a separate peace treaty with Britain. Such a peace would have helped Britain win the war, but it would have prevented Britain from acquiring Palestine and enabling a Jewish state. Influential Zionists in the United States worked to scuttle a potentially peacemaking U.S. mission to the Ottoman Empire by accusing U.S. diplomats of anti-Semitism. The result was the illegal birth of the Zionist regime in 1948, and Zionist state terrorism on a grand scale ever since then.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.